After her mom received a diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer and was pressured to endure invasive procedures that would ultimately do more harm than good, Dr. Casey Means had a revelation about the medical system. It is not working. It treats symptoms without ever getting to the root cause, and it often prioritizes profit over patients. You guys are absolutely going to love this conversation. She is the author of Good Energy, the surprising connection between metabolism and limitless health. We're going to be talking about all of this and so much more on today's episode of Relatable. Dr. Means, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. First, could you tell us who you are and what you do?
My name is Casey Means. I'm a medical doctor. I'm an author of the upcoming book, Good Energy, and I'm a co-founder of Levels Health, a metabolic awareness company.
Okay, and I first heard of you. I saw a tweet thread sometime last year about you losing your mom and an article that you wrote that basically said, look, I'm a doctor. I've been in the medical field for a long time, and you can't always trust us. And that statement, accompanied with your mom's story, was really powerful for me. And I think for a lot of people who realize that we can't always trust the experts.
Well, I think my mom's story is very almost like archetypal of what so many Americans are going through today, kind of realizing that something is not quite right when it comes to our own health, the health of our kids, the health of our parents. People are so sick in our country and they're getting sicker. And we're put on this chronic disease, sort of pill taking surgery treadmill, and yet we're not really getting better. So my mom's story really just is so emblematic of this and played off so much of my own experience in medicine as a surgeon. So my mom, she was very vibrant and, from the outside looked pretty healthy, but in her 40s, she had me. I was an almost 12-pound baby.
Oh my goodness.
I was big. Everyone kind of congratulated for that. No one really thought much of it. She had trouble losing the baby weight. She was in her 50s, had a tough menopause. Then in her 60s, she started getting, the diagnoses that so many Americans have. High blood pressure. Here's an ACE inhibitor. High cholesterol. Here's a statin, prescribed 200 million times per year in the US. High blood sugar. Here's metformin. Very common. This is, pre-diabetes. It's a pre-disease. Nothing to worry about. And then all of a sudden she's 72 and she's hiking with my dad near their house in Northern California, and she gets a pain in her belly. And that's unusual for her. It lasts her a couple of days. So she goes to her primary care doctor. They order a CT scan, and it turns out it's stage 4 widely metastatic pancreatic cancer. And 13 days later, she was dead. And, at the time of her death, she was seeing what a lot of people would call like the best doctors in the world. She was being she was being seen at Stanford. She was being seen at Mayo Clinic, really access to high quality healthcare. And the oncologist looked at my family in the eyes and said, I'm so sorry. This was so unlucky, the pancreatic cancer. And knowing what I know about really more a connected root cause perspective on health, to me, it's very clear that this cancer was not actually unlucky. It was totally predictable. But in our Western medical system that is so reactive, it's so siloed, it's like whack-a-mole medicine. They saw all those things that my mom had throughout the past 30 years as separated, isolated things. The big baby, the trouble losing the baby weight, the tough menopause, all the metabolic issues, blood pressure, blood sugar, cholesterol, and then cancer. In our system, in our reductionist Western medical system, they all look separate and it seems unlucky. But what I'm really, I think, on this planet to share, and what my book is about and what all my work is about, is that through a different lens, through a root cause lens, through a true physiology lens, what we would understand is that all those symptoms and diseases she had are actually trunks of the exact same tree. And that tree is metabolic dysfunction. It's a core physiologic problem that's affecting 93% of American adults have some aspect of metabolic dysfunction. Some of the most obvious ones you'd think about it would be like diabetes and obesity, but actually cancer, heart disease, stroke, depression, anxiety, having a big baby, which is called fetal macrosomia.
I don't know, and a lot of people don't know the through line of the different diagnoses that you're talking about. Like going back to you being a 12-pound baby, the only understanding I have of why that typically happens is if a woman has gestational
Right.
diabetes. So is that part of what you're talking about? And all of these things are somehow connected to each other?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the trunk of this tree, this metabolic dysfunction, it can show up like gestational diabetes. And at its very core, and not to get too science and
That's
technical,
okay.
but in our society today, with the rapid changes in our diet and our lifestyle over the past just like 50, 75 years, really since World War II, our industrialized diet, our chronic stress from our devices, we're getting 25% less sleep on average than we were 100 years ago. The
Wow.
incredible amount of synthetic toxins in our food, water, air, and homes, it's fundamentally caused a problem with our cells that is super fundamental. It's a breaking of this metabolic machine in our cells, and metabolism is how we convert food to cellular energy. And the reason that this can look like so many different diseases is because if you have a problem converting food energy to cellular energy to power our cells, in different cell types, this can look like all different things. If it's, in a liver cell, it can look like fatty liver disease. In a blood vessel cell, it can look like heart disease. It can look like in the brain, it can look like depression and anxiety. So essentially, there's this core issue that's caused by our lifestyle and our food system that is really breaking our bodies on a fundamental level, showing up as all these different diseases across the spectrum. And our healthcare system is totally blind to it, which is why they wait until the symptoms emerge and they treat those isolated symptoms, but they never get to their actual root cause because that's not the way our system works. It's about
Yeah.
separation, not connection. And it's such a blind spot, but it's such a lethal blind spot that it's really why it inspired me to write a book about it. Because, you look at the trends that are happening today, which is that the more we spend on healthcare, we're spending $4.5 trillion a year on healthcare in America, and outcomes are getting worse. The more studies we do, the worse the outcomes are getting. The more specialized we get in healthcare, the worse the outcomes are getting. It's sort of the definition of unsustainability. And the reason is because we're actually focusing on the wrong problem. We're focusing on reactive symptom-based medicine as opposed to the connected root cause that's actually underlying most of the American diseases that we're facing today. And in the case of the big baby, in a mother who has this metabolic dysfunction, her blood sugar starts rising. That then transfers in the blood through the placenta to the baby. So the baby is exposed to that high blood sugar. That then causes the body to make more insulin in the little fetus's body. And that insulin is a pro-growth hormone that causes the baby to put on more weight and more fat. So it's how those metabolic blood sugar issues are actually showing up in the fetus. And then being born above about 8.5 pounds, which is considered fetal macrosomia, that sets up the baby for metabolic issues for the rest of their life, and also is a sign of the mother having issues.
And when you talk to the doctors, you said these top doctors, they didn't have anything to say about her previous diagnoses. They weren't interested in that conversation at all.
No, I mean, really, if you look at the way the system is designed, it's so hyper specialized. We have over 42 medical specialties, and really, like, to climb the ranks as an American doctor, it actually is getting more and more specialized. So I trained in ear, nose, and throat surgery. And to really be at the top of my field, I would actually specialize further into either ear, nose, or throat, become a rhinologist, a laryngologist, or an otologist. And then even within those specialties, you might focus on one specific disease and become the world expert in that. So specialization is literally built into the very foundation of prestige in our system. And what that does is it gets doctors to, really ignore the rest of the body and how things might be connected. There's also a financial incentive for that, right? The business model of our healthcare system is to do more to more people over long periods of time. The stark reality, the stark economic reality of the American healthcare system, which is what needs to change if we're going to actually improve the health outcomes of America. But the stark economic reality is that every institution that touches our health, from hospitals to clinics to pharma, even to insurance companies, will make more money if you are sick and less money if you are healthy. And so chronic diseases, these isolated chronic diseases like what my mom had, diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, the system profits off treating those as separate things that you do things to for long periods of time, chronic disease management. So not actually healing it, but managing it. And so because that's built into the deep finances of the largest and fastest growing industry in the United States, which is the healthcare industry, there is no incentive for people to back up and look at all of the things going on and say, wait a minute, maybe we're looking at this wrong. Maybe there's something more fundamental, the trunk of the tree leading to all of this. Maybe we could just intervene there and a lot of this stuff would melt away. And that is the reality biologically. But because of the trillions and trillions of dollars that are baked into the way the system operates right now, no one has any real incentive to stop and to do that. And so the pieces actually get actively held apart. If you think about going to the doctor, how often if you have several specialists you're working with, how often are they talking to each other? Never. Usually the health records are in different systems and it's almost impossible to even have one doctor see the notes of another doctor from another specialty. It's literally baked in on every level, the separation, which is not serving patients, it's serving the financial interests of a reactive sick care system that is fee for service.
After your mom was diagnosed, what did the doctors recommend?
So this was what was so funny was that the second she got the stage 4 pancreatic cancer diagnosis, it was like full court press from so many different doctors. They wanted a hematologist to help her because her blood counts were low. The cancer was sort of causing her to destroy her red blood cells. There was radiation oncologists, surgical oncologists, medical oncologists, radiation, surgery, medication. There was a liver doctor who wanted to put a stent in, and everyone was talking, and it was incredible how much of a flurry it was. And we all kind of looked at each other and thought, wow, 40 years of symptoms that we kind of know are all connected. And not once was there like a flurry of activity to like truly get my mom healthy, to truly get her cells to heal. But the second there was this big diagnosis, very late stage, everyone flies into motion. And what was interesting is that the diagnosis was so bad. Pancreatic cancer outcomes are so bad. And my mom was so in touch with her body and her really spiritual knowing that she knew like this was very bad. And she had this sense that it was going to be fast. So we actually declined all the crazy amount of interventions they wanted to do and went home. And she was able to die peacefully at home, 13 days later. Everything they recommended, nothing would have even basically had any time to have an effect before she died. And
even if you took that 66% chance that she could live a little bit longer or that it would do nothing, she would still possibly, if she took those routes that the doctors were recommending, because this was COVID era, she would have been dying in a hospital alone by herself. She would have been going to these procedures by herself. And you all knew that that's just not the end that you wanted for her. That's not what she wanted.
Yeah. And those numbers that they gave us didn't even take into account the additional complications she had. When she showed up at the hospital, the diagnosis, she was in liver failure because of the metastases in the liver, and her blood cells were depleted. So I think even that 66% of maybe having a benefit was so overblown. And so we looked at all this and said, no, like we don't want to give my mom up to the hospital where she would have almost unquestionably generated $500,000 plus of revenue for that hospital and had to die alone in a COVID lockdown unit. So we asked questions, and they of course were super shaming to us about, not doing the internet, just that it's irresponsible. Literally the liver doctor, if this was my mother, I would absolutely have her in there for that liver stint. I mean, she's in fulminant liver failure. She can barely. This is a few days after the diagnosis. She was getting worse really quickly. She was feeling super weak, and they were saying, you got to get her in here. And, it's just so wild if you think that people who might not have the confidence or the background in medicine to ask some of the deeper questions, I think probably 95% of people would just kind of go with whatever the doctors said. Again, they're like the best doctors in the world. And it would have done nothing but hurt her. And that's not to say that people shouldn't take the intensive route, but we absolutely should be asking questions. And I think the system, one of the ways it's become so damaging, especially more recently, is that the system has really created an environment where people, I think, struggle to ask questions. We've been told, you think about the last 5 years, plastered on billboards practically, trust the science.
Yeah.
Trust your doctor. And what's so alarming to me, and again, one of the reasons why we wrote this book, is that the system, when it comes to chronic health issues, has really done very little to earn our trust. As we've started medicalizing these chronic diseases, which are primarily based in diet and lifestyle, and many of which didn't even exist 75 years ago. If you think about an acute patient, that's not recurring revenue. But a chronically ill patient is recurring revenue for decades. And so essentially the system is asking us to not ask questions and to trust blindly because of the trust they engendered from acute issues, apply it to chronic, where they're abjectly failing at keeping us safe. They're not preventing these conditions. They're certainly not reversing these conditions. They're just managing them. Their revenue model is based on more patients going through the system as quickly as possible, which lends itself to going in, getting a prescription, and leaving.
And you mentioned, both in the article and you mentioned it in this conversation too, the profit incentive. You talked about how your mom going through all of these procedures would have generated $500,000 for the hospital, but you've also mentioned how the doctors specifically have a financial incentive, right, to push some of these routes to go down when it comes to diagnoses like your mom's.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I would say, just to start, like, every single doctor I know is like a very good person who went into healthcare with noble intentions. That is the reality. But unfortunately, we're taking these very bright, eager minds who want to help, and we're putting them in a system with just one dictum, which is economic growth. And so what happens is that every level of the education and the way we practice and the science gets corrupted, right? Because of that financial incentive. And so I think in many cases, doctors feel like they are practicing good medicine because they're following the science, they're following the guidelines, not totally realizing all the ways in which the science and those guidelines are heavily influenced by things like the pharmaceutical industry or the ultra-processed food industry. So you've got these good minds practicing in a bad system. And I remember when I was in my 5th year of surgical residency, going out to like launch out as an independent surgeon in the world, the senior surgeons would sit down and talk to you about the business of medicine and say, as a private practice surgeon, you eat what you kill. And that's unfortunately a very unfortunate euphemism that basically just means your income is based on how many surgeries you do. You eat what you kill. Your income is how much you do.
Yeah.
And so because that is the way that you'll get paid, that's how your mortgage is paid and your kids' tuition, of course you want to do as many surgeries as possible. Many physicians, are paid by hospital systems based on how many RVUs they generate. RVUs are essentially billing units. And so the more you bill, sort of the more supported you are as a surgeon. And so it's just built in on every level.
You've explained really well what's going on in the system and why corruption happens. Do you think that how doctors are educated in the medical school has anything to do with this? Or do you feel like this really kind of starts after they get out of medical school, once they start practicing, once they see how the so-called game is played? And again, I'm not trying to ascribe bad motives to all doctors, but as you said, this is just kind of how everything works. Like, do you think it goes all the way back to education, or do you think it happens after they're in the field and they're just playing the game as it's played?
Oh, unquestionably. I mean, I think it starts as early as college. Like, if you think about it, everything in our system funnels you towards fragmentation and specialization as a marker for increased success. So in high school, you learn about, all biology. You learn about plants and bacteria and cells and human cells. You kind of learning about everything, animals. Then in college, if you're a biology major, you focus on human biology. Like my major in college was human biology. So you go from all life to humans. And then medical school, you start focusing on each organ system within the human. Like literally the way the education is structured at Stanford Medical School where I went is like you have a nephrology block and you have a hepatology block and you have a neurology block and you have a cardiology block and you have a gastroenterology block. It's like the body is just these individual parts.
Units, yeah.
And then you go into residency and you specialize in one of those. And then you go to fellowship and you go deeper. So built into the brains of people is disconnection. It's not seeing things as a system. And what's interesting is that it's basically like we're just practicing outdated medicine, because 75 years ago, when we didn't have, metabolomics and proteomics and we couldn't visualize inside the cell the way we can today, the only way we could describe diseases was basically like how they looked, like the symptoms. So like, oh, depression is this constellation of symptoms. That's how we define the disease. And only recently have we been able to define diseases based on what's actually happening inside the cell, more like physiologic pathways. Okay, so the mitochondria is dysfunctional and we have chronic inflammation and we have oxidative stress and these like invisible processes that we can't see. And when you look at that level, what you find is that those same disturbances, these invisible microscopic cellular disturbances, are actually happening all over the body. Obviously, we're one body, and they're just showing up in different places as different symptoms. But medicine hasn't caught up to describe diseases based on what they really are, which is what's going on that invisible layer. They're still describing diseases based on collections of symptoms because that's what we can see. And so, of course, depression looks different than cancer. Of course, arthritis looks different than erectile dysfunction. Of course, infertility looks different than a stroke on the outside. But when you zoom in and really look at what's happening inside the biology, it's all the same thing. It's almost like the system has designed this whole ecosystem that gets us to distrust our own internal knowing about what's right for us and how to be healthy. And what I really want to share with people is like, to really just not accept that. Like, I believe that every person has such deep internal knowing about what's right for them. And we've just been asked to be like divorced from our common sense in a way when it comes to the health of ourselves and our children and our parents, and to really put that agency outside of us to our great detriment. And like, just step back for a second. We're the only species in the world with a chronic disease and obesity epidemic. And we're the only species in the world with experts and PubMed, where all the scientific papers are. It's like, we are the only species that is eating ourselves to death.
And so we're simultaneously being expected to have the level of confidence and expertise of a doctor while also being told you are too stupid to even ask basic questions about your health. And so we're put in this very tenuous situation of having to be our own healthcare experts and advocates because our doctors are like, I don't know. Even with thyroid, asking my endocrinologist, is there anything I can do outside of medication to help? Nope. The answer is always no. So, okay, I have to become an expert in nutrition. I have to become an expert in metabolic health. I have to become an expert in thyroid. But if I ask you these questions, it's like, how dare you ask me? So it's just so difficult to be a patient in the United States.
It is.
Or maybe anywhere. Maybe it's like that everywhere. I don't know.
You speak to such an important point, which is this sort of trap that we're in where we are both dependent on the system, but also, really aren't getting good quality out of the system. And so it's like, it's such a tug of war. Like, you're kind of not getting the full answer, but we're also kind of dependent on it because things are pretty bad with health right now. So we have to keep going to see these specialists, but not quite getting the answers that we want. But there's not really a good alternative, right? Unless you're like finding your own functional medicine doctor, which like I recommend for everyone, like someone who's really trained to see the body as a unified system. Life expectancy is going down in the United States. Like 6 in 10 adults have a chronic illness. It's all bad,
70%, I think, are technically obese or at least overweight.
75% overweight or obese. 50% of American adults with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, almost totally preventable. 30% of children with prediabetes. That was 0% 50 years ago. 45% of children overweight or obese, nearly 20% of kids with fatty liver disease, things that doctors would never have seen in their career 50 years ago, 40% of 18-year-olds with a mental health diagnosis. It is bananas, like what is happening with the stats and the trends, but I'm very optimistic because we are living in a time where just in the last 2 to 3 years, there's sort of this personal empowerment revolution, I think, happening in our healthcare system. Part of it's technology, and part of it is, I think, the response from COVID. People are feeling a lot more like, I need to be more of an active participant in my healthcare because the healthcare system really let us down during that period. So with the technology side, just in the last few years, there's now tons of companies doing direct-to-consumer lab testing, so you don't have to beg your you don't have to beg your doctor for basic lab work on their timeline. You can literally just go online and order 100 biomarkers for $499. It's amazing. And then with deep interpretation. So that's one. There's now wearables, so you can really understand a lot of your core vital signs.
Is that what that is?
This is an Aura ring. Yeah.
Oh.
So this tells you about my sleep, my steps, my oxygen saturation,
Cool.
my heart rate variability, stress levels, all sorts of things. So that's really amazing because then if I start to see something going in the wrong direction, I can take action myself, before it gets to be a problem. We've got biosensors like continuous glucose monitors that can tell you in real time what's happening with your blood sugar, as opposed to waiting a year from now for your doctor to give you a single data point about your blood sugar and maybe say, oh, it's getting worse or whatever. You can see it now in real time without having to go to your doctor. So there's these trends of personal empowerment and data that are very, very exciting. And currently they're expensive. They're not necessarily accessible to everyone, but it's a movement towards, okay, I'm going to be in control of my day-to-day health to hopefully avoid some of these chronic lifestyle diseases that are totally plaguing us. So that's very, very exciting. And then to speak to what you were talking about with the thyroid and the kidney, I think a big message that I want to really share with people is that it's not as complicated as we've been led to believe. So if we think about symptoms anywhere in the body, liver, kidney, thyroid, all symptoms that we have are necessarily the result of dysfunction within our cells. They have to be. Our entire bodies is just 40 trillion cells. And we don't have a symptom arise out of thin air. It has to arise out of dysfunction in how our cells are working. And there's not actually that many things that affect how our cells function. It's literally food, sleep, movement, stress, temperature, light, and toxins. Of course, there's genetics, but those pillars, which I talk about extensively in my book, those are the knobs that we can turn to change, how we're meeting the needs of the cell. So if you have a symptom, it means there's cellular dysfunction. And if you have cellular dysfunction, then you need to run through the list of what's affecting your cells and take stock of what could be hurting them or helping them and make adjustments. And most of the healthcare crisis we're in today could really be wiped away if we actually just sort of ran through that list and of those different pillars of sort of lifestyle and environment and thought about how am I meeting the needs or not? And then a question would be well, how do I know? And one of the ways is by just looking at your own biomarkers, like I just talked about, getting the lab testing, whether it's from a direct consumer company or from your doctor, basic lab markers that your doctor orders, and look at what the biomarkers are saying. So if you have symptoms and your biomarkers are off, it means you need to turn some of those knobs probably on those dietary and lifestyle things. And again, pretty simple how to do that. It's get more sleep, move more, eat more real food, less processed food, etc. Again, all outlined in my book, but so we have to be empowered, understand a little bit about the biology, understand a little bit about how to interpret our own biomarkers, which I'm happy to talk about if you want to, and then just have the boldness to take action in our own lives. And sometimes that means being a little counterculture and doing things a little differently than everyone else in your community is doing. And it's worth it because being sick is not fun.
Yeah. And speaking of counterculture, there is kind of a movement, and I don't know how prevalent it is in the actual medical world. It's kind of something that we see more on social media. The body positivity movement, which I think has some positives to it. Absolutely. I don't think that everyone needs to look to a supermodel who is underweight to be, the standard of beauty or the standard of health. And so moving into a more realistic view of the body and health and strength and all of that, I think can be good. But just like any trend or movement, it can swing too far. And we have seen kind of an either normalization or even glorification of unhealthy lifestyles and obesity, and a push against what is referred to as fat shaming, even by doctors. And so I think there is a fear of saying one type of choice or one type of lifestyle or one type of diet is bad. Do you see that in the medical world?
Oh, this is definitely happening in the medical world. People are petrified to piss anyone off in our world right now. I think we have, unfortunately, an epidemic of cowardice that's happening in our country because people are so afraid to get any backlash. It is very simple to know if you're metabolically healthy or not. You literally have to look at 5 biomarkers that are generally free on your annual physical.
Yeah.
And these are the criteria for metabolic syndrome, which is fasting glucose, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, waist circumference, and blood pressure.
Okay.
And if people have a fasting glucose under 100 milligrams per deciliter, a triglyceride level under 150 milligrams per deciliter, an HDL cholesterol above 50 for women or above 40 for men, waist circumference less than 35 inches for women and 40 for men, and blood pressure under 120/85, they fit the criteria for metabolically healthy. And they will likely have a much lower rate of all the chronic diseases affecting Americans today.
Wow.
It's that simple. Those are basically free because if those biomarkers, one or more of them, are not in the proper, the healthy range, it's a signal that there's a fundamental problem with how your cells are converting food energy to cellular energy, which means that you're going to have essentially underpowering of this miraculous body. And of course, that will lead to dysfunction, which shows up as symptoms. So I would just implore people to just make sure they understand their levels on those biomarkers. And then, of course, there's lots more advanced testing you can do to know more about your health, fasting insulin levels, inflammatory markers, liver function tests that together can also add richness to the picture of sort of underlying health. But like every American should know where they are, whether they're in that 6.8% or not. And if they're not, they should do everything in their power to get there and make that number bigger, because it will have wide-ranging positive impacts on every aspect of health. And it's pretty simple to do.
Wow.
Just eat real food, sleep, move your body, manage your stress, don't overload your body with synthetic toxins, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Give us some tips, if you will, as we kind of close this out, on how we can advocate for ourselves to our doctors. You have been in all the positions. You've been a patient. You've had a parent who has had a life-threatening, a fatal diagnosis, and you are a doctor. So from all of those different angles, how should a patient best advocate for ourselves or our loved ones?
That is such a great question. The primary thing I would say is that never be afraid to ask questions and always probe deeper. You are the customer. Like, you get to ask the questions. And if your doctor's not willing to sit with you and ask and answer your questions, like, find a new doctor. I think one thing that people can do if they're feeling sort of lost in their health journey and like they're seeing a bunch of different specialists and it just feels like they're going through the revolving doors, consider seeing like a more holistic focused doctor.
Definitely. Well, Dr. Means, thank you so much. I really do encourage everyone. They can go ahead and pre-order your book.
Yes.
Okay, so they can pre-order your book. It'll be out May 14th. I'm so excited for you. I hope it's a bestseller. So I'm so excited to read it. I'm excited to go back and listen to this conversation, to take notes on everything that you said. So thank you so much, Dr. Means. I appreciate it.
Thank you.